Your story runs on a Thursday morning. Within 48 hours, it's on every major network. The president's press secretary gets asked about it at a Saturday briefing. By Sunday, your editor's fielding calls from the Pulitzer committee. You have done it, the story of the century, the one every journalist dreams about from the first day they pick up a pen. There is just one problem, and now someone knows. You didn't start out wanting to lie, and honestly, nobody who ends up where you ended up ever does. You graduated from a good school with a journalism degree and a conviction that the press still meant something. That getting the truth out there was worth the sleepless nights, the rejected pitches, the editors who never responded. Your first job was at a mid-sized regional paper in Ohio covering municipal zoning disputes and high school sports. You told yourself it was temporary, a stepping stone. 3 years in, you were still there. The stepping stone had become a floor, and the floor was sinking. Then your college roommate got a staff position at The Atlantic. Another friend landed at the Washington Post. You went to their housewarming party in D.C. and smiled through the whole thing. On the train ride home, you opened your notes app and typed the same thing you'd typed 100 times before. You need a big story. Find the big story. The pressure to succeed in journalism is not something people talk about honestly. It doesn't come from editors screaming at you across a newsroom. It's quieter than that. It comes from the gap between who you thought you'd be and who you actually are at 31 years old, writing about a parking variance in a suburb you've never heard of. And that gap does something to your judgment over time. It wears it down like water on stone, so gradually you don't notice until the damage is already done. You didn't set out to fabricate anything. What you set out to do was survive. But that is how it always starts. His name was Daniel Reeves, or at least that's what he told you. You'd been investigating Veritan Defense Group, a mid-tier military contractor, for about 6 weeks, and it was routine stuff. A tip about inflated billing on federal contracts. The kind of story that might get you a small mention in the trade press, maybe a letter from a congressman's office. Then Daniel called, and everything about the story changed. He told you Veritan wasn't just inflating invoices. He told you they were selling defective body armor components to the military. Now, that soldiers had died because of it. That the company knew about the defects before shipment and had buried the quality control reports internally. He showed you what he said were internal documents, pages of them, with government letterhead and redaction marks and dates circled in red. You asked him how he got them. He said he'd copied them before he was let go. You asked if you could verify them independently. He said that was impossible, that anyone who knew about this had signed NDAs or left the company. Here's where a better version of you would have stopped. You didn't stop because the story was too good, because it explained everything you'd been suspicious about, and because Daniel was sitting across from you with detail after detail that fit together like a puzzle you'd already been trying to solve. You went back to your apartment and spent 4 hours trying to reach the soldiers' families. One didn't respond. One said they hadn't heard anything about defective equipment. The official cause of death in both cases was listed as hostile fire. But Daniel had an explanation for everything. The families wouldn't know the difference. The official records were altered. The cover-up went all the way to the procurement office. You told yourself you'd verify more before publishing. You told yourself you'd reach out to Veritan for comment. You told yourself you were being careful. What you were actually doing was falling in love with the story. And that is the most dangerous thing a journalist can do. Daniel stopped returning your messages for 2 weeks. You told your editor you were close, that the story was solid but needed another few days. He didn't push hard because he trusted you, and because the vague outline you'd shared had already made him lean forward in his chair. 2 weeks later, Daniel resurfaced. He said he had one more document, the critical one, an internal memo, dated March 2019, from Veritan's VP of Operations, acknowledging that a batch of ceramic plate inserts failed compression testing, but were cleared for delivery anyway to avoid a contract penalty. He emailed it to a burner account he told you to use. You downloaded it, read it 3 times, and it was exactly what the story needed, sitting right there on the screen, like it had always been waiting for you. What you never did was send it to a forensic document examiner or call a former colleague at ProPublica who had contacts inside the Department of Defense procurement office. or reach out to any of the 11 other employees listed on the org chart Daniel had given you. You were on deadline, 2 months deep in a story where every instinct said the documents were real, and where you wanted them to be real badly enough that the difference had stopped mattering. You filed the story on a Tuesday night at 11:52 p.m. Your editor came back with edits by 7 a.m. He changed 3 sentences, tightened the lead, and added a line noting that Veritan had declined to comment, which was technically true because you'd sent them an email 8 hours before filing that nobody had read yet. The story ran Thursday morning. By 8 a.m., it was the most read story on the paper's website by a factor of 6, and by 10 a.m., 3 senators had issued statements demanding a congressional inquiry. And by 2 p.m., you were on the phone with the editor of the Washington Post, asking if you'd be interested in a staff position. You said you'd think about it. You hung up the phone and sat in your desk chair, and for a few minutes, you felt exactly like the journalist you always wanted to be. Then your phone buzzed again. You answered it. The voice on the other end said 4 words. I know it's fake. His name was Douglas Farr, and he'd worked at Veritan Defense Group for 11 years as a quality assurance engineer. He wasn't calling to threaten you. He was calling to ask you a question. He was asking about the memo you'd published, the March 2019 internal document, and he wanted to know where you got it. You said you couldn't reveal your source. He said he understood that, but he also said the document format was wrong. And Veritan switched internal document management systems in January 2019. The memo you published used the old header template, and nobody at the company would have used that format after January. You told him there could be explanations for that. He said there could be, but there were other problems. The VP of operations named in the memo had been on medical leave during that entire month. His signature on any document during that period would have been unusual enough to flag immediately. You hung up the phone and sat down on the floor of your apartment, not because Douglas Farr had proven the document was fake, because he hadn't, not definitively, but because for the first time, you let yourself actually look at what you'd done. You'd never sent the documents to a forensic examiner. You'd never found a second source for the central claim, when Daniel Reeves had no verifiable identity. The email address he'd used was created 3 weeks before he first contacted you and had sent no other messages. You thought back to every conversation with Daniel, the way he always had a perfect answer ready, the way the story got better, not murkier, every time you pushed, and you remembered something your first editor had told you years ago. The sources worth trusting are the ones who seem scared, the ones who ask if they can think about it overnight, the ones who say, I don't know, when they don't know. Daniel had never once said he didn't know, and now 3 United States senators had called for a federal investigation based on your story. Veritan's stock had dropped 22% in 2 trading sessions. The company had retained crisis communications lawyers and was threatening to sue. The Washington Post still hadn't officially offered you the job, but they'd asked for a formal portfolio submission. The way you saw it, you had 2 choices, and you already knew which one you were going to make. You did not choose the option that let you sleep. You sat down with your editor and told him that a source had contacted you claiming the documents might be questionable. You framed it carefully. A disgruntled former employee trying to muddy the water. Probably a Veritan plant trying to discredit the story before the congressional inquiry got started. Your editor looked at you for a long moment. Then he asked if you were confident in your sourcing. You told him yes, you were confident. That moment was the second time you crossed a line, and it was worse than the first. Because publishing without verification was a failure of process, but lying to the person who trusted you was a choice. Over the next week, you tried to reach Daniel Reeves with a new urgency. The number was disconnected. The burner email account was deactivated. The address he'd given you in his original email turned out to be a UPS store in suburban Maryland. You hired a background check service using your own money. No Daniel Reeves with that description existed in Maryland, Virginia, or D.C. Meanwhile, the story was gaining momentum you couldn't stop. A congressional subcommittee scheduled a hearing. A former soldier's family gave a press conference claiming their son had complained about defective gear before his death. They hadn't said that to you originally, but the story had given them a framework, and now they were filling it in. You watched it from your apartment and felt something you hadn't felt since Douglas Farr's phone call. That family was grieving. and their grief was completely real, but they were attaching it to a story you could no longer be certain was true, a story that might have been invented by someone you couldn't find, for reasons you didn't understand. You opened a new document and typed the words, "I need to speak to my attorney." Then you deleted them. Then you typed them again. The congressional hearing was in 9 days. Someone was going to testify under oath about a document you had never verified, and you were the only person in the world who knew it might be fiction. You testified on a Tuesday morning in late November. You sat down with a prepared statement in front of you and your hands completely still. You were proud of that detail later, in a strange and hollow way. The committee chairman asked you to describe your sourcing methodology. You described it the way it should have been done, not the way it was. But here's what you didn't know. While you were preparing for the hearing over the previous 9 days, a freelance digital forensics researcher named Aisha Powell had been quietly examining the document you'd published, hired by Veridan's legal team. She'd found metadata in the PDF file showing the document was created in a version of Microsoft Word that didn't exist until 2021, 2 years after the date printed on the memo itself. She published her findings on a technology law blog at 9:14 a.m., the same morning as the hearing. By the time you walked out of the hearing room at 12:47 p.m., your editor had already called 3 times. You sat in a bathroom stall in the Russell Senate office building for 11 minutes before you called him back. He said 2 words, "It's over." Your story was retracted the following day, a full retraction, the paper's first in 31 years. Every outlet that had republished your reporting followed within 48 hours. The congressional subcommittee canceled its next scheduled hearing. Veritan's stock recovered. The congressional inquiry was dropped. The soldier's family released a statement saying they felt used. Douglas Farr, the quality assurance engineer who first called you, gave one interview after it was over. He said he'd tried to tell you. He had, and you knew it. You never followed up. Jayson Blair fabricated and plagiarized dozens of stories at the New York Times before being caught in 2003. Stephen Glass invented sources and events at the New Republic across 27 published pieces before a single fact check unraveled all of it. Janet Cooke won a Pulitzer in 1981 for a story about an 8-year-old heroin addict who did not exist. She returned the prize 2 days later. None of them started out planning to lie. They started out exactly where you started, wanting the story badly enough to stop asking whether they'd actually earned it. The pressure to succeed doesn't excuse any of it. It just explains how the gap between who you wanted to be and who you actually were became large enough to fall through. If this story stayed with you, the next one will too. That video is on screen now.